This lesson we're going to talk about multiplying integers. Remember, integers were those positive and negative numbers. So like -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3. One thing we have to remember is when we do some of the math, we wrote this back a few lessons ago, like this dash on the outside of the parentheses like this. You remember that stands for the opposite. So anytime there's a dash outside the parentheses, that stands for the opposite of a 5. So the opposite 5, remember, that's the same thing as a -5. So these are equivalent. They're interchangeable. And this is how we actually use this strategy to multiply integers. So when I see this 5 times a -11, we keep the 5 just like it is. But the -11, what we do is we pull the negative outside of the parentheses. We go backwards, if you will, make it stand for the opposite symbol. So instead of saying a -11, I'm calling it now the opposite of 11. So I bring out the opposite symbol since those are equivalent. So then I can kind of just do 5 times 11. 5 times 11, of course, would be, remember your 11 facts are pretty easy. 11, 22, 33, 33. Let me try that again. 44, 55. If I continue on, there would be a 66, a 77, 88, and a 99. So those first 11 facts are pretty easy as well. So 5 times 11 would just be 55. And then this just tells me to take the opposite. So the opposite of 55 would be then a -55. So one of the things we do with multiplying integers is really what we do is we just think like a light switch. Think like a light switch. So if there's one negative, it's going to just flip it to a negative. So if we look at this next example, instead of seeing this as a -7 times a -8, we can treat this as the opposite of a 7. And then the opposite of an 8. So I can actually pull the negativity out of the problem since those are equivalent. So then all I have to do is know what 7 times 8 is. So you can either use your tic-tac-toe board for your 7s or your trick for your 8s. And we would end up with this 56. And then we got to take the opposite twice. So the opposite of a positive is a negative, but then the opposite of a negative switches back to a positive. So again, one negative is going to flip it to a negative. The second negative is going to flip it back to a positive. So the answer is actually a positive 56. So notice that when there's 2 dashes, or in other words, if there's an even number of negatives, what's going to happen is the answer is going to switch to a positive. So if there's like 2 negatives or 4 negatives or 6 negatives or 8 negatives, kind of see what I'm saying? If there's that many negatives in the problem, your light switch is going to end up switching over to a positive side of it all. So one negative is going to flip it to a negative, but that second negative is going to flip it right back to a positive. So if there's an even number of negatives, it's going to make a positive answer. So if I look at this next example, notice I have a -5 times a -3 times a -4. Again, we're allowed to pull the negatives out of the problem. So I can pull those 3 dashes out in a multiplication problem. And then I just have this 5 times this 3 times this 4. Now, multiplication can be done in any order. I like the 5 times the 4 because that would be 20. And then I just have 20 times 3, and that would be 60. So the math gives me a 60 if I do my multiplication. But notice that you got 3 little dashes out here. It's like you have to do your switch 3 times. So it switches to a negative, it switches to a positive, it switches back to a negative. So if there's 3 dashes, in other words, if there's an odd number of dashes, like 1 was odd, 3 is odd, 5 is odd, if there's an odd number of dashes, so if there's an odd number of negatives, it will switch to a negative answer. So it's negative, positive, negative. So it's going to end up switching back to a negative in the end there. So -60 is your final answer. So that's kind of the rules we play by. So one makes it negative, the second makes it a positive, the third makes it back to a negative. So if I look at this next example, yes, there's 3 numbers, but notice that there's only 2 negatives. There's only 2 dashes. So there's only 2 dashes on that problem. So I have 6 times 3 times 2. Again, I can multiply in any order. I'm just going to go say, well, 2 times 3 is 6. So all I really have to do is figure out what is 6 times 6. And 6 times 6 is that rhymer. 6 times 6 is the 36. So the answer is going to be a 36 when I do the multiplication. But notice that since there's an even number of negatives, one negative flips it to a positive, the next one's going to switch it right back to a, so one negative switches it to a negative, and then the next one switches it right back to a positive. So again, an even number of negatives makes a positive answer. So hopefully that helps you out when you are multiplying integers.